Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today we have our 18th conversation with Abdaljawad Omar. We wish it wasn't so many, not because we don't enjoy each other's company, but because it also means that there is a genocidal war that is still going on 18 plus months after October 7th, 2023. Take a minute, like, subscribe to the channel, turn the notifications on, and support us via either Patreon or buy me a coffee. Definitely need the support of the viewers. Appreciate everybody for showing up today. Make sure to share the video with your friends, your family members, community, and so on. Abdaljawad Omar is a Palestinian scholar and theorist whose work focuses on the politics of resistance, decolonization, and the Palestinian struggle. He has written extensively in Arabic, in English, in addition to being a frequent contributor here at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. He has contributed to Electronic Intifada, Ebb Magazine, Material, Mondoweiss, Rusted Radishes. He's got one coming up, and maybe we can. I'm trying to. Oh, Salvage. He's going to be in the new edition of Salvage that's coming out. So a lot of great work that people should all check out, whether here or elsewhere. And check out the playlist if you missed any of the conversations that we've had. We've had a lot of great ones, and I'm sure this will be really good as well. Aboud, good to be with you again.
Good to be with you, Jared, as well.
All right, so we were just kind of chatting beforehand, and I think the thing that is probably top of mind for me right now, and I think for many people, is kind of this uneasiness. And one of the big events was that Qassam Hamas agreed to release an American Israeli hostage, or prisoner of war, really, because he was a soldier. And they agreed to release him. And this was an interesting move because he was the last living American that they had, right? And so in some ways it's letting go of some piece of leverage that might seem quite important on the one hand. On the other hand, Israel seemed not to have been involved in these negotiations, so it seemed to have been kind of a direct negotiation between Palestinian resistance and the United States, which is basically new terrain as I understand it. And it coincides with this really weird trip that Trump is taking through the Middle East, where he's selling hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons to various Arab regimes. And there's like kind of a talk. Hamas, I saw, released a statement again today that basically that there are ongoing ceasefire discussions that they're participating in that they hope will be successful, but they also kind of hedged in their statement of saying, if it's not successful, then it means that we may not be able to ensure the safety of the hostages, something along those lines, right? And so this is happening. At the same time, you have Israel definitely intensifying their the amount of airstrikes that they're doing, the campaign that's going on in Gaza. There's more discussions I'm seeing of reports of them kind of create. Frank Kitson had this term counter gangs or pseudo gangs, but creating like fomenting groups of people to like raid food supplies and stuff like that within Gaza, and trying to create a chaotic situation. And then if any kind of civil defense groups or policing groups kind of come together to try to stabilize things, then they attack those folks. I don't, again, I can't verify it, but this is just stuff like Mondoweiss was been talking about this and so on. And so there's just a lot going on. And I think on the one hand, when there was that release of the recent prisoner, there seemed like a lot of elation from certain people within Gaza that we might be on the brink of a ceasefire. yet, hasn't materialized yet. And so I'm just wondering, like, how you're kind of reading and thinking about all of these different things, and what do you see as the prospects right now or possibilities?
Well, thanks. I mean, it's quite a tough nut to crack because for a lot of reasons. Because I think in many ways Israeli strategy, like this kind of ambiguous, uncertain, and to be honest, like quite shaky ground on which Israel's latest renewal of its genocidal war, more broadly, stands. Is perhaps also the point. I mean, it's in many ways, one day you hear it's about military occupation, revival of settlements. The next, it's ethnic cleansing. At times, it's merely a pressure campaign that uses, and employs daily massacres and destruction of Palestinian lives in Gaza in order to pressure the release of prisoners without an end of the war, or to force Palestinians to self-deport or self-dispossess. So the larger picture seems quite hazy, and I think much about the current Israeli strategy really echoes patterns we've seen even elsewhere when it comes to, these fringe cults and sometimes more structured political movements, like, in the case of Trump, where, there's a lot of strategic incoherence, if you want. And in this sense, uncertainty isn't actually not an aberration of the political method here, but it's actually the very principle of it. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just an exception to the logic. It's kind of the algorithm of effect, disorientation, through which attention is first of all seized, held, and indefinitely prolonged. Think about how Trump moved in terms of the tariffs, for instance. Now we see with Israel, agreeing to a ceasefire, then retracting, then going back and intensifying its campaign. And even if you look closely on like the discourse in mainstream media around, for instance, the imposition of tariffs, some on one level they're deployed to unmake the global economic order. On the next, they become instruments of national reindustrialization, or sometimes they just appear as tactical, means through which to negotiate with countries and reduce, trade balance. So you see these kind of over-interpretive, or this kind of temptation to over-interpret these moves in many ways. And I think this is part of the problem, or part of the strategy generally, of this sense of indeterminacy is part of the strategy currently, where there's like a multiplicity of gestures all going on at the same time, and none of which really arrives at any sort of closure. We cannot really distill this kind of simple means to ends type of logic, which generally is placed front and center when it comes to discussions around international relations or geopolitical competition or things along those sorts. And I think this is not only Israel. I think Israel is one of the most advanced expressions of this form of incoherence as a strategy. But it's also like people like Modi and Orban and Trump and others across the world. And I think here meaning lies in the ambiguity itself, and again in the shifts, the withdrawals, the shedding and reshedding of form that this strategy places, whether it's through things like tariffs, or in the case of Gaza and Palestine through massacres, which becomes more bloody and visceral and of course full of pain. Two different, they echo the same type of let's say technique or technology of power, but they manifest differently because it's like, I would describe it, it's like hitting, in the case of Gaza, it's like watching waves crash against an already kind of splintered boat, and every time the wave hits, it retreats for a while and then sheds the boat even further. And I think in many ways the retreat for a moment, when we see like these sighs of reliefs, I don't think that the settler machinery is surrendering. It's only calibrating itself in a different way. It's like a pause before the next surge, And in this strategy, I think unpredictability, chaos, And I think a dose of planning as well is part of the whole point of what's happening. So it also comes across with negotiations under fire, as Netanyahu would place it front of center. Now there's we were talking before we came online, and you talked about this like whole idea of the fog. And I think fascisms just generally thrive on uncertainty, on shock and awe, on this relentless seizing, shedding, reshedding, retreating, then punishing. And I think that in many ways it's meant to disorient us, in many ways to demobilize us, to create this sense of impotency in front of like the relentless manifestation of this will to kill, for instance, or will to disorient in many instances as well. In the case of Israel, there's also like this sense of which war has become not really an end in of it, not really an end to some political grammar, some new political grammar, but as some form of waiting on the part of Israeli government, which has a messianic tendency, from which just the sheer presence of war itself, there's kind of this hope that at some point the Messiah might enter the picture, and things might completely become clear again for Israel. And I think we'll talk about it a bit later on how I think this war is a symptom of Israeli failure and settler implosion in many ways, despite its relentless brutality. But again, it's a language of uncertainty, flux, and shedding that is going on, and within this, there's a lot of contradictory and self-conflicting language again, and it's quite hard to take a position. Like, for instance, let's take the discussion around Trump and Israel, which there's some genuine analysis that we can actually build, where Trump is actually distancing himself from Netanyahu, for instance, on a personal level, egoistic level. There's some sort of, battle of egos going on between these two personalities. But at the same time, there's this surge within the MAGA world of American nationalism, which wants to assert itself and dominance, even vis-a-vis a country like Israel, which for some within the MAGA world view that Israel itself has too much power within Washington, and therefore that has to be pushed back. I don't think this is like a pro-Palestine line, but it's kind of this kind of pro-American nationalistic slash a brute form of imperialism, but also at the same time isolationist. And it's also self-contradictory. It has these three different elements altogether. People like Tucker Carlson, or for that matter, that speak that language, at least on some level. So there's that level of, you can see something festering also within the right wing in America, where there's some distaste towards this, idea of giving Israel everything that it wants and desires. On the other hand, we can also read it more cynically as something that is taking out of the Biden playbook, where, distancing from Israel sometimes serves, a sense of enabling Arab governments, for example, to receive Trump with, these festive, displays of homage to the empire and the emperor that is coming to visit, as we've seen in Riyadh and the Emirates and of course Qatar at the same time. So, that distancing was needed, at least for that visit to commence while the genocide still occurs. So that could be just a rhetorical device, because what we know now for certain, based on leaks that are coming out of ex people within the Biden administration, that the Americans never really asked for a ceasefire to actually unfold within the context of Gaza under Biden. They never actually told Israel that they should cease the war. That's one element of it, that this is just a rhetorical kind of cynical ploy meant to ease the room, make it less tense. And I can sense that, because also within Arab media, there's a lot of organizations like Al Jazeera, which is funded by Qatar, have pounced quite heavily on this kind of idea that Trump is being is strategically moving away from Israel, or there is some sort of void or I don't know, distance happening between Netanyahu and Trump, and therefore this is an opportunity, at least for the Arabs, to kind of bargain with the Trump administration and try to see if there's something that could be managed in terms of provisioning a new ceasefire agreement, etc. So there's that discussion as well, and I think I'm more on the cynical side, perhaps, rather than that this is a real form of distancing, because I think what we should be quite certain, or where our eyes should be locked on, is whether the Americans actually do any concrete moves in using their leverage. Otherwise, it's just all political rhetoric and hubris. I think within that context, I think Hamas wanted to give also its own gift to Trump and his visit, on the hope that that would be seen by Trump as a positive sign of engagement. Also because the Americans are engaging directly with the Hamas leadership, which have never really happened before, at least officially. And on that level, I think that the idea of releasing the American-Israeli soldier would have fitted this paradigm where you're not losing much in terms of your bargaining chips, but at the same time, it's a gesture that would allow you or permit you to cement some sort of credibility with the American administration in the hopes of moving the negotiations forward and getting something out of the Trump. But I think today we're seeing the Israeli response in a massacre that has already taken the lives of 200 people, mostly women and children, in the Gaza Strip. And of course, the bombardment of 2 hospitals at the same day, and all these different ways that Israel is still attempting to shock us and through its monstrosity at this particular moment. So I think Hamas was attempting to try, to see what it could garner from this kind of engagement. I'm not sure if now they're assessing that engagement was a mistake, or if this is really something of the type of brute use of force before a real ceasefire commences. I'm not sure. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty. But what I would say is that also it seems to me Israel is hesitant. It speaks of grandiose plans of conquering the Gaza Strip. It speaks of occupying the Gaza Strip, speaking of mobilizing the reserves. It speaks, but it's been 2 months, and they're speaking of these concrete plans as a means to perhaps cover for the actual strategy of completely just massacring the people. Because I think at some level they have to present some sort of coherent strategic picture, specifically for their allies. What are you guys doing? And they have to have a response on that level. On the other, it might be that this is, an attempt by the Israeli government to at least, get the Palestinian resistance movement to release as many Israeli prisoners before it commences with the plan that it already has, which is to occupy the Gaza Strip and perhaps ethnically cleanse it, or at least control it indefinitely. So, it remains ambiguous, Jared. I can't really answer that question in a concrete fashion and sense. I mean, it leaves these things open, and that's part of it. But I think as Israel does that, it's quite, to me, certain that, or at least the certainty within this kind of chaos and uncertainty, if you want, is that it's, maneuvering within a space that is quite hard to sustain, at least in the long term. In the sense that what we're seeing within Israel itself is this quiet sense of implosion happening within institutions, within political parties, within society, on multiple levels. And I think that, to me, war seems more as a symptom of Israeli failure than success. And this is not to take away any of the successes, whether tactical or strategic, that Israel has been able to garner, specifically when with its war in the north, including its ability to assassinate much of the Hezbollah leadership, and in Syria this change of guards, or if you want, change of the regime, with this new regime that is coming and eager to basically please the Americans and the Europeans, and try to find some space for itself within the Arab, let's say, regressive alliance, which includes Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Qatar, etc., and of course with the backing of Turkey. So that sensibility, at least, that is happening on that front is one thing. But on the other hand, it seems to me that Israel is stuck in force and violence without the ability to transform some of these successes into an actual political strategic change that actually benefit it in the long term. And that's one of the problems that Israel is facing at this at least current moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and obviously on the one hand, Trump has a cabinet that's full of, in my opinion, some of the worst people in the world, and plenty of Zionists, and even like you say, like a lot of the moves. I mean, I had a conversation with Two Black and Rasul Moa, and we kind of had this discussion too about trying to pinpoint strategy. What is the plan? Even in just some of the moves like defunding USAID and like all of these different things that Trump's doing, hollowing out a lot of the bureaucratic state, which can just be against, it can just be a part of removing people who he sees as against his agenda and so on. But the even these deals that he's announcing, and I'm not paying attention to every aspect of this, but a lot of it is just comes down to kind of financial transactions of certain points, like selling a certain amount of Boeing jets to Qatar, or arms and defense deals, which are not, again, these are not meaningless things, but America is essentially a weapons company. And so, just selling a bunch of weapons on behalf of arms manufacturers, basically. And yet there's like, and I don't know whether there will be, but, of course, the other element of this is the Iran negotiations too, that are going on right now, which is an interesting, component. And I mean, I see Iran personally as being in a place where it has lost maybe a lot of strategic leverage in some sense, just due to the degrading of Hezbollah and the fall of the Assad leadership in Syria and so on, and then now the Ansar Allah having a kind of unilateral ceasefire with the United States, which is an interesting piece as well, because they also did that without having a ceasefire with Israel. And so, yeah, I mean, there's just so many elements of this going on that feel quite transactional. I always feel like with Trump, there's a desire, not to psychoanalyze him, but a desire to broker deals, right? And like what the content of those deals is maybe is less meaningful to him than just being able to tweet out, hey, I did this, look at me, I'm the deal guy. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, my feeling around Hamas is that maybe they see a potential opportunity there, but I guess I'm not seeing also like anyone who's really seems to be supporting them in those efforts regionally, other than Ansar Allah continuing to put pressure on, Israel through, the bombing of the airport in Tel Aviv and things like this. But yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky thing, all of what you lay out. I don't know if you have any more to say on that point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think that, Hamas prefers on some level Trump to Biden, for instance, because I think on some level as well, Jared, Biden was a real Zionist, like an ideological Zionist. He believed he drank the Kool-Aid, if you want, and he had that commitment, political, genuine commitment to the state of Israel, to its expansion, to its narrative, to its of course a lot of people did. A lot of actually most of the intellectual output from liberals and even liberal left since October 7th have been even those reckoning with Israel and what has become, it's basically mourning Zionism. They're mourning it, confronting it, sometimes genuinely, but trying to shed this relationship to this idea, whether from a nationalist or Jewish centric point of view, or from a point of view of being stuck to this ideal of building a state within the Middle East, liberal, democratic, whatever it is. But Biden is that type of person. And his team was also quite cynical, quite manipulative, quite would practice double talk, but also still committed to the cause, to the Zionist cause. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump is less supportive of Israel on any way, but within his domain, within his and this is also part of the desire why we try to think of Trump as a personality, despite the importance of structures and institutions and forces beyond the person himself. And I think it's always more, good for analysis to come out from this kind of commitment to analyzing structures, classes, institutions, and their role, or let's say their framing of the social world and the political order we live in. But there's a sense of psychoanalyzing Trump because this person is quite unpredictable, and perhaps this kind of unpredictability is itself, a symptom of something happening within the context of, the U.S. But I think he's less ideological. No, he's becoming transactional means you're less interested in ideology, less committed to a cause out of some sort of metaphysical or political or subjective servitude to this cause that you place front and center as a as a source for your own meaning and sense of purpose in the world. And I think within Trump we don't see that much, and I think that's what also Hamas quite senses. That's one element of it. The second element of it, I think, there is a lot of changes go unnoticed. Now, this is very, very risky of me to say, and I've said it quite a lot of times. Perhaps it's a hopeful form of analysis. I take these leaps of faith in people more broadly, but people should take me, on surface value when it comes to this. But I think that seeing, kids being killed for, about 17 months now, or 18 months, has a cost. And it's quite reasonable to think that also within the American political, elites and those now managing, let's say the White House, there's a sense of, that Israel and everything around Israel is becoming more and more controversial, more and more risky, more and more, that there's a sense of desire within, let's say, the American population for a more assertive, even American nationalistic perspective coming to the fore, specifically from the right wing. And I think that's a genuine, there's a genuine shift there on some level. Of course, with the right wing, it's not any concern for the Palestinians per se, or a pro-Palestinian position for that matter. But there's this kind of pro-American nationalist, again, we talked about this, that I think is coming to the fore, and it also comes as a response to this kind of state with Israel on some level. I know that there's a different current within the right wing, which is, sees in what Israel doing as something to emulate, something to basically repeat, and I think there's much of that also happening within, the American right wing as well. But there's still this kind of egoistic battle between Netanyahu and Trump, which is also an egoistic battle between America and Israel, who controls who, and who has more influence on who, and who has to follow the orders of who, at least on this kind of symbolic let's say, political theater level. Like there's that sensibility happening there. This is not, this is not, just to qualify it, this is not me making a structural analysis of who really leads who, which comes out of political economist and systems theory and people like Samir Amin who have quite heavily shown that at the end Israel plays this kind of how would you say it? I forgot the word, but plays a role within the nod.
Yeah, a client state or
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's something around the political theater of it that is also kind of like manifesting, at least at that level. But again, I mean, I see also this kind of distancing that suddenly came about before Trump's visit as more political theater than real politics going on. That's my position. A lot of people disagree with me. Now, that it's happening is also significant. That American president needs to do this distancing is significant. That he shows more willingness to engage with these kind of Arab regimes who are also wedded to the American empire and to global flows of capital and to their own role within the dollarization of international finance and their importance also within the flow of raw materials, specifically oil, into the global economy, and at the same time trying to get American protection, military and diplomatic and otherwise, ensuring their survivability in the near future, but also in the long term. I mean, that these countries have, as some analysts are claiming, are having a larger, let's say, a larger role in defining American policy within the region. I mean, that's one thing. And most people are pointing out two things, which is that these governments now are against an attack on Iran. At least that's the claim. We can also take that with face value. It's not necessarily so. But the claim comes, or the logic comes from the idea that, in 2018 or 19, when Iran hit Aramco oil, production factories in Saudi Arabia, that the Saudis and other Gulf regimes didn't see a, strong, powerful American response. And therefore, they do not want to enter into this kind of vortex of war with Iran that could actually lead to the disruption of oil supplies, to economic, crisis within their states, but also, and more importantly, to destruction of much of their infrastructure, specifically the infrastructure tied to oil and natural gas. And in some cases, you can see that is a logic that is actually important for example, for a country like Qatar, which has one mega LNG factory that turns natural gas into liquefied form, and that sits across the Persian Gulf, and that is easily that could be easily targeted by Iran in any war, and could actually lead to the country to lose one of its viable assets that actually brings a lot of economic flow to the country. So there's a logic around that this is why the Arab governments don't want this war to happen. And because Iran could close the Hormuz, the Hormuz channel, that straight. And at the same time, you have the other line of thinking that Israel is pushing for an attack against Iran, and that a lot of the Arab governments in the region are viewing Israel as now this kind of like crazy, messianic, non-cooperative government that is getting away with a lot, and the Americans are unable to leash it in a significant way, and therefore that now Trump is listening closer to these Arab allies than to, for instance, Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. There's some sensibility to that line of argument. I'm not saying that there is not. There's one level of it. The second level, I think, which is also quite central. I think a lot of these governments as well sense and are buying into, but not only the governments, also the Americans are buying into the idea of Iranian weakness, that this is the time to target Iran. And, Israel has proven its vitality on the battlefield. And therefore, we should, either permit or interplay with this kind of American, Israeli moment of madness to garner as much concession, either from these Arab governments with their financial prowess, or from the region as a whole, or from Iran itself, that could be agreeing to an agreement with the United States at any point in the near future, with an agreement that could see some sort of detente being established, but between America and Iran, of course, a detente that also includes countries like Israel and, of course, the Gulf regimes. So there is that sense of also, openness towards the possibility of an attack against Iran at this current moment, specifically after the heavy blows that Hezbollah incurred, and the loss of Syria from a geostrategic point of view that was aligned with Iran. So these are the two competing, or I wouldn't say competing narrative, but complementary narratives, strategic narratives that are being placed. What I want to point out is that Israel does not have a narrative thus far, except for war itself. And this is one of the signs, the symptoms, if you want, of how war in of itself becomes a symptom of failure, or we can read it as a symptom of failure, because it's it is on some level highlighting some of its tactical successes, operational successes, things that it has prepared for the past 16, 17 years since 2006, like attacking the pagers, or the walkie-talkies, or penetrating Hezbollah in a way that opened it for intelligence, and therefore served to target its leadership and other formations. But at the same time, still Israel is incapable of really building a narrative around this war, a narrative of renewal, like Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted to actually place this war, or decisiveness of ending Palestinian presence and claims and demands, or of even extracting its prisoners from within Gaza, or even making Gaza, as they say, unlivable, therefore that the Palestinians would themselves leave. So they're still stuck, and this kind of stuckness, and still repeating the same massacres as for some sort of political gain, or for the Messiah to come in and solve everything for you, or for decisively ending the Palestinian cause, is not really leading Israel into a concrete strategic narrative that can tell its own people, and then come out of this war having renewed itself. And I think there's a lot of signs of failure within Israel that we can point towards more precisely at this current moment.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I kind of want to talk about that next. I mean, for one thing, I just want to make a comment, which is I just think that it should be clear, I feel, that the United States I don't think the United States in any way wants war with Iran. I mean, the fact that 2 F-18s falling off of an aircraft carrier in the Red Sea led them to, go into a ceasefire with Ansar Allah unilaterally, and not even worry about trying to include Israel in that, agreement. I mean, maybe they worried about it, but they were willing to do it without that. It just says to me that I don't think there's any world in which Trump is interested in the type of military engagement that could lead to any number of significant casualties for American, troops or military hardware, really. Which doesn't mean that, they wouldn't necessarily, let some other proxy force, fight the war from them. And we can come back to that later, maybe. But I just want to say that I think that moment revealed something, or should reveal something quite clear to people, that there is so little appetite right now for the United States, putting its own troops and forces in that kind of situation outside of, maybe contractors or some special forces or something like that. Anyway, the point that I wanted to come back to that you talked about earlier is this. You talked about kind of a slow implosion, or something like this, quiet implosion within Israeli society. I would just love for you to talk a little bit about, because I know, because of where you're located and the media that's around you and all that, you are able to follow this in a way that people in the West, I don't think, have a great sense of, even if they kind of try to check in on, Israeli media time to time and stuff like that. So what is your sense of that? What are the dynamics of that you are paying attention to right now?
Well, I mean, look, I think from the outset, when we started these conversations and we spoke about, the breach of the wall surrounding Gaza, and this moment of surprise, strategic surprise that quite created the disrepute for the Israeli intelligence and its military, and the crumbling of the southern command of the Israeli army. I think that this is the outward explosion of Gaza as a camp, as a site for revolutionary infrastructure, as a place through which besieged, gone through war, managed to basically create this moment that interrupted, if you want, the script and the rhythm of what was unfolding within Israel already, which is this kind of internal incoherence, at least on many levels, which is this kind of ideological political fight between right-wing messianic forces and, of course, the secular liberal elites, which is also has a lot of different manifestations, different lines of if you want, it's ideological, it's religious, it has elements tied to territorial expansion, it has elements tied to view of the self and the future, and along those lines. And we saw that kind of internal battle already happening within Israel with the protests that erupted before October 7th. People against the Netanyahu government and people for the Netanyahu government. So there is already this kind of internal dissonance, if you want. And we shouldn't, over exaggerate it to the extent that that means civil war, or that means that Israel is, because I think, again, I do believe that the Israelis have still, within that dissonance and incoherence, still that ability, despite it, all of it, specifically when there's the specter of the outside enemy, and because of all of the forms of education and ideological education, and that there's a level of coherence that they might fight in the streets in the morning, and at night still go to the military base and fight together. But I think, when we think about that explosion, there's a moment, I think, that, where Israeli, vulnerability was exposed not only to the world, but to Israelis themselves. And I think, if we think about this term implosion, it's like, in the physical sense, names a moment where the structure collapse, onward, under kind of a weight of, maybe internal pressure. So it's not really a destruction from the outside, but from within. And, it's a shell that perhaps once was reinforced by, different forces, sometimes opposing forces. And, at this level, implosion kind of like shows how it could be destabilized, inverted, or made to converge kind of inward. And I think in many cases of implosion, the surface remains at least intact for a while. The surface level, the everyday, but there's something in the core that actually vanishes and caves, and that's why I think implosion is kind of a silent violence, if you want, and overload and reversal, and in this sense, we're kind of tracing this becoming of collapse. The point at which a structure no longer sustains itself, and in many ways, I think that it transcends these moments of intense rupture or revolt or resistance. Like that's one of it. It's not really that, it's not about moments of intensification, if you want, but it's about like slow processes, like things that are happening. There's something in the void, that the core, that simply cannot sustain itself, and then the structure begins to crumble. And if you want to really think about it, Jared, like, I think on some level Israel is now going through an ideological exhaustion. No, there's like a collapse in its performative aspect. And I think how would I say it? It's like it's wearing thin. Its rhetoric is wearing thin, and the very phantasm that once really animated, Israeli state claim to legitimacy, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's the memory of the Holocaust and its weaponization in the way Israel has done, whether it's effacing its racialized status, whether it's all of that is kind of or its perpetual emergency, its theological entitlements. All of these are like the doctrine of eternal victimhood, the dream of or civilizational supremacy, and Jews versus Arabs, and this kind of all of that is it's not resonant as it was before. Let's put it that way. There's an exhaustion even among Israel's friends, if you want, even those that want to see Israel succeed, in being able to perform these ideological points and actually get away with them. And I think this is quite apparent to me when the American state mobilizes forces, police forces, to basically start picking people off the street in an effort to intimidate. That's a moment where this becomes clear. In America, whether it's in other places across the world, you can see that inability of Zionism to actually still maintain itself as legible. So there's an implosion on this level. There's this kind of ideological exhaustion. And we should remember, Israel started as an ideology, then became kind of like, a material fact, if you want. It's not like, in the context of Palestinians, where we're living here and Palestinian identity rose as a self-defense, you're rooted in the land, and then you construct these kind of symbolic elements. It's the other way around when it comes to Israel. So when we speak about ideological exhaustion, when we speak about it in many ways, I think that has long-term effects that will start to basically prove that they're relevant to us, and they're relevant already in analysis when it comes to Trump. His distancing from Israel at this current moment, even if it's just a maneuver, because it's for, at some level, it's a right-wing president, a Republican, making that maneuver, or maneuvering in such a way, which is quite strange. It's usually liberals that do that, not, it's usually Biden's and Obama's and, people like that who do this kind of like maneuvering around, the relationship with Israel, but not people like Trump and what he represents and embodies, at least coming from the right wing. I think the other like level of it is like there's a crisis also of reproduction within Israel on some level. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate or make it like something that would give people a sense of being very definitive. But I think reproduction is generally seen as like kind of biological or material, but in the context here is like is Israel capable really to reproduce itself across these different registers, like schools, screens, soldiering, through elections and hysteria of enemies, like it once did before? I think on some level it's still within that domain where war itself enables it to reproduce on some level. But I think that we're seeing signs of glitch happening within this kind of if you want Israeli cyber or cyborg, or the settler cyborg that is trained to scan, occupy, execute, and vote. And I think there's some glitches happening. The machine is basically shuddering, and I think on some level, for instance, we can see that with conscripts and some within also the reserves fleeing the service within Israeli military. I think the elite cohesion within Israel is fissuring. I mean, the struggle between the right-wing settlers and the security network that, generally speaking, led Israel, specifically from within the military commanders. It's insignificant, quite significant that, there's a politicization of who is leading the major security organizations within Israel. It's significant that the right wing is attacking these institutions and trying to hold them in a way that makes them less resistant to their policies and the way they want to move. And that kind of internal resistance, that internal fight that is happening, occurring, whether with the Shin Bet or whether even with the Mossad or whether with the IDF or all of these different organizations and institutions, tell us that there's a slow shedding of this kind of elite cohesion within Israel and the dominance of the security network. And I'm not sure that this security network will cede ground without resistance, even if it becomes at some point, a form of violent resistance. And of course, now it's quite reasonable for these forces to stay in this kind of, zone of not really engaging in direct fights, except through media and, political maneuvering and legal maneuvering. But because there's an ongoing war, and that's what the right-wing settler groups are also garnering from the war, this kind of internal, let's say, a coup that they're organizing within the Israeli state itself and trying to control every facet of it, the bureaucracy, the institutions, the security, the military, the intelligence, and of course, all that comes with it. But I think what's happening is that this kind of social compact between the different parts of Israel and its ideological manifestations is also, one where, the internal war is being postponed. But until when, we don't know. So there's a slippage there. Trust is crumbling between the army and the cabinet as well, between the yeshiva and the drone operator, if you want, between the state and the semblance of the people as a whole. And I think also what is significant, that reproduction also kind of demands from us some sort of fantasy of futurity, or demands from Israelis some sort of, fantasy of futurity, that tomorrow is worth sustaining today's, for instance, cruelties or something like that. But I think that, with Israel, there's also a lot of dread when it comes to the future, specifically from the liberal secular, let's say, version of Zionism, which resides largely within the Tel Aviv area, but not only. So I think the war in Gaza, as much as it's cruel, has reached this kind of point of saturation, and I think has exposed the limits not only of, has exposed Israel not only to the world in the ideological part that I was speaking of, but also to itself. So in large part, visibility is also becoming vulnerability, specifically when you declare, that the intention here is total victory, that you want to decisively end the Palestinian presence, yet that Palestinian presence remains, the demands remain, the struggle continues. That's a glitch that you cannot really overcome so easily. So I think that this is where, the future, at least for Israel, begins to stammer. There's something that within that fold that it begins to stammer, and I think we can see it because of this kind of edifice of overextension, excess, massacres, war continues unabated. But and even if it kills the camp and kills Gaza and kills even the Palestinian city, and crushes all the buildings and the infrastructure, but it really cannot win. It's setting itself up for failure on many levels. So it can only prolong, deflect, on some level delay the confrontation with its own unsustainability. But I think you can say there's a lot of tactical agility in Israel, and it's very impressive, and we can agree with that. But its agility is quite of a drowning man. Having said that, of somebody who's drowning. But having said that, Jared, generally Zionism had that comfort with being, on the verge of apocalypse, and this is where the problem lies with analyzing, Israel specifically as a society. The existential dread, the existential anxiety, the feeling that you're always on the verge of collapse. This always has helped sustain Israel to some degree, and actually provisioned it with this kind of force of, overcoming oneself, trying to do your best. But I think, there's something different about the current crisis within Israel. I mean, I'm not saying that this means that Israel is imploding to the extent that it will cease to exist as a coherent, society and state. But there's something that is worth tracing and, trying to really understand, at least on this register of like the crisis of reproduction, if you want, that is also, I think, important when it comes to discussing Israel more broadly. I think that, and also like this, cruelty that they're, exhibiting, this obscene form of I'm not sure what the long-term consequences of that, on their society. I mean, I'm not saying here what's the long-term consequences on us, because of course it's quite horrific, but there's kind of, this kind of visible cruelty, not only devours its own alibi, if you want, all what you say to yourself about your legitimacy, your ideological career, all the things that but I think that, there's a psychic vertigo, if you want, and there's an effective grammar that you start to also not believe with yourself, and here, on this level, you hear Israelis screaming and the settlers screaming, but the world, hears only this kind of static discourse coming out of it, which is a discourse of cruelty, obscene genocide, the sense of need for power. But this affect will crash at some point, and I think will return with vengeance within Israel itself. Those who are used to, enter people's homes and destroy them or kill, despite this whole tribal sense of solidarity that exists within Israeli society, it could easily turn bleak within Israeli society itself. And these are the kind of like this kind of affective use of, visible cruelty in such a way, and its practice among its soldiers. And we should remember that these soldiers are also like reserve soldiers. They're, everyday people. They're not only military, professionals that, operate on the level of the professionalization of the military itself, but are also people who work and go around. And, you can start to see this sense of not only entitlement, this ability to turn towards violence, but I think that will have a heavy price on Israeli society in the future, specifically because it's so obscene and so visible, not only to the world but to themselves as well, that they're taking joy in this cruelty. And at some point, that form of cruelty will turn inwards, or might. There's the potential, let's put it that way, for it to turn inwards, not only directed towards us, the Palestinians that live within their domain. And I think that, these type of these forces, whether affective, whether ideological, whether they're in the crisis of reproduction of futurity, these are important to point out, because I think in the past couple of months also people have kind of gotten used to idea that Israel is, successful on some level, and their, large part of the discourse has turning towards Israel is winning, or Israel is, incurring and accumulating a lot of successes. It is true. Nobody's denying that, because I think within these crises, no matter how, how real they are, there is a sense of tactical successes, strategic changes that are favorable to Israel, things along those lines. But we should remember that sometimes what in the immediate, presents itself as a success, it turns out to be a source of actually impending collapse and danger. Specifically when you're excessive, you overextend, and you show little signs of the old Zionist pragmatism that was capable of both committing the massacres, and yet at the same time find some sort of adjustment and common ground and political grammar with the region and the people around him. And I think that one of the problems with the Israeli government and with people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others is that that political grammar of pragmatism is quite missing. And that leads them to overextend, to overkill, to overdo it in ways that will actually be, I think, at least, quite problematic for Israel's future and for even its sense of the ability to actually construct a future, to construct that narrative of past, present, and what comes next.
Yeah, thank you. These are a couple just random things that I've noticed over the last week. One last week on Saturday, I had this. I joined Saturdays with Renee. Shout out to Jared Ball and to Renee Johnston, who host that show. But Renee, who loves to read massive reports and then make other people read them too, sent me the Harvard reports on anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias. This is what it's actually called. And anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Palestinian bias. So they did two separate reports. And I'm not going to go through all of it. If people want to check out the conversation, they can. They can also check out the reports. But the thing that was most interesting to me was that so much of Harvard's emphasis was actually on how Israelis were being treated at Harvard, and not even, they weren't, to be clear, they didn't have instances that they were citing of, anything that would constitute, a hate crime, or even, I don't remember seeing much in terms of, negative speech towards them. It was mainly that people didn't want to be their friends. It was mainly that people were, when they found out that somebody was Israeli, they immediately became uncomfortable and walked away and never spoke to them again. And it was a fascinating kind of, it's like 400 pages long. I don't encourage anybody to read it, but that was, so on one end, this was just interesting, right? Is that through all of this, that what they're concerned about is the kind of standing of Israelis within Harvard. They do broaden it out to Jewish people, of course, but they also even are honest in the report in saying that the percentage of Jewish students at Harvard who are either Israeli or have family members or close connections in Israel is higher than it has ever been in the university's history. So they constitute a larger percentage than it has been at any other point in the past. And it was just a very, it was basically a 400-page report. Some of it laid out the history of how Harvard has, platformed in the past both sides of the conflict, and done a lot of these different, attempts to get people to come to the table and talk and debate and dialogue and all of that, and how this has largely broken down over time. But it was just fascinating to me that at the end of the day, what they were kind of bemoaning was that the college experience for Israelis in the United States is not what Harvard wants it to be, that they don't think that it's kind of sustainable. And so they had a set of silly recommendations and things like this. But that was the crisis that they were kind of responding to within the report. The other thing I saw too, and I don't know how widespread this is, but I saw a couple of tweets this week of people who had gone through the process and they showed the paperwork and whatnot, who had formally renounced their Israeli citizenship and removed themselves as citizens, and were proudly displaying this on social media of like, sorry, this took longer than the process should have, but I've finally done it. And obviously this is a situation of people who are dual citizens. So they, still had American citizenship and so on, and they were just renouncing the Israeli part, but they were going through a formal process. Like they had to apply to the state of, I don't want my citizenship anymore, go through it, and they did it. And again, I don't know that that's widespread. Maybe only a couple people have done that, but the fact that that is something that some people are doing, I think also speaks a little bit to the kind of crisis of reproduction of kind of both, and of those are different examples of this doesn't feel very sustainable for young people, especially that, either I'm going to be socially isolated because people are uncomfortable with what my society is doing, or I want to distance myself from this thing because I do see it as morally abhorrent, and I don't see a space within Israel to have meaningful, you know, politics that distance myself from what is going on. And so I just thought those were interesting things. Again, I don't want to overstate their importance either, but it kind of, I think, speaks to maybe some symptoms of some of the stuff you're talking about.
No, I mean, yeah, I think that there's much to say about various forms of implosion that are happening across various registers, including, international legal mechanisms, institutions that, were late to the game in terms of trying to hold Israel accountable. They're too slow to actually enforce any sense of impunity, and that still governments don't respect enough to actually do something about it. So there's that level of, the erosion of, this liberal normative space through the human rights discourse that, has failed in the test of Gaza, and will also have repercussions on what we call international law and international humanitarian law and other forms. There's a level of dissonance happening between publics and governments, elites within countries like the UK and the US and Canada and other places. And I think that I don't want to overstate it. Of course, you, Jared, know, and the rest of you know much more about American society, and I probably, most people in America do not really think of Palestine on a daily basis, but and even have biases against Palestinians in many ways. But I think that there's that dissonance at least happening within the more active, at least political conscious, politically, of those more politically conscious within these societies, and a dissonance with their elites, and that will have repercussions. It already did with Harris, when she was not elected because she was running on joy. And I think for a lot of people within the Democratic Party's fold didn't feel the joy while babies are being killed in Gaza. Like there was that dissonance between the Democratic establishment and a lot of the Democratic base, at least the progressive part of it, that also impacted the election in some way. And I think that is happening across different elements. And when we chase these things, these forms of implosion, that will happen. And that also will happen with Israelis when they travel. I mean, there was a big scandal in Thailand with an Israeli tourist saying that she built Thailand with her money, and Thai people coming out and, on TikTok and social media, attacking her. I mean, that type of relationship with when Israelis, when they travel in Italy, there's a restaurant that kicked out an Israeli, goers to the restaurant, and also there was a big deal in Napoli, I think, or something like that. So you're hearing a lot of these stories about, the sense of Israelis being met with more disdain among people, more feeling of mistrust, more feeling of, how can they live with this cruelty that they're exhibiting visibly. There's a cost to that on that level, on the level of tourism and their daily interactions and things like that. And of course, that will have a level of it. And I'm not sure what Harvard can do to make people love, and socially accept. I'm not sure how you can do that. I mean, there's a level to that, that is quite problematic, and I'm not sure what they can do to face that. And I think this is, for me, it's also irreversible, that process that is happening. Like I don't think that it's easily reversible as people say. I mean, I don't think that when the war quiets, that the images that people saw, the truths that have been revealed, the cracks that have opened will be easily effaced by time. Maybe, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think that there is a level to what's going on that has deeper repercussions than Israelis even realize today, because they're hung up on their own drug, which is today the drug of war.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think it's as easy. At the same time, I do think that institutions are, and it's interesting, you have seen a couple of institutions start to even more recently adopt like divestment proposals, even as this is becoming more and more, there's a lot of efforts to even criminalize divestment and even talk of a federal ban on, basically criminalizing divestment from Israel, which is nuts. But again, like even those efforts, as you say, reveal how fragile this thing is on some level, because obviously nobody likes that you have to enact a law to stop people from distancing themselves from something. It reveals how fragile it really is. um but like the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian bias report, which was much more tough to read because it was literally students who are dealing with, hey, my family members are being killed and nobody cares within the administration at all, or I can't get promotion within this university because there's Zionists who are the tenured professors, or who are choosing who goes forward, or so there's a lot more institutional racism and barriers that are being faced by Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian students at Harvard, which shouldn't surprise anybody, but it's quite real. Um, but on one of the recommendations in that report was divest, and I think part of the reason that they do that also is these are people whose mindset is the sustainability of this university, and they're thinking you have to take steps to distance yourself from this. Like, if you don't do something, it also makes it even harder for those Jewish students and Israeli students that you're worried about, that the university isn't taking any steps to say, hey, this is not a space that is directly funding, Elbit or settlements, or all of these kind of things. And so I think in some ways, on an institutional level, the logic, or the pros and cons, the calculus of that is changing, or is somewhat more in danger than it has been in the past, because we could say in the past, okay, there are these material benefits to staying invested in this thing, and maybe there are some ideological benefits, or some benefits in terms of support of wealthy donors who also are Zionists, or so on. But now they have to also weigh this about, like, how do we maintain a sustainable campus, and what do we do when the majority of our student body disagrees with our position here, as well as a lot of our alumni, and so on. And so, yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to overstate those things or talk about how quickly they would lead to any particular outcome, but I agree with you in terms of, I don't think it's very easy to see those trends and dynamics reversing, even after this is over, because there's just so much that you can't unsee, and it's so hard to imagine a world in which what has happened, people feel like it has been made right, or it has been, that we've moved into some place of, okay, now we can kind of move on from that. um so another thing you brought up that you wanted to talk a little bit about, which was unusual, was the Thomas Friedman article that came out recently. Um, yeah, what do you want to say about that?
Don't read it. No, I'm just
Right. Don't read anything in the New York Times, but definitely don't read that.
yeah. No. I'm just thinking that, like, first of all, I think that there's a sign, like Thomas Friedman maneuvering, and this is what we should be careful about, just generally speaking, is these liberal Zionists specifically that are trying to redeem Israel by centering, one particular version of Israel as problematic. And I think in his article, he tries to say that the current Israeli government is not an ally of the US, which seems like a radical statement. And maybe it has kind of repercussions among, elite opinions in the US, and specifically liberal elite opinion. But I think that type of maneuvering within the liberals of trying to place the onus of what's going on the shoulders of one particular version of Zionism is quite problematic, because when it comes to the Palestinians, there are versions of Zionism and some post-Zionists, some anti-Zionists within Israel, but they've never really played an important foundational role, at least within Israel itself, nor they have played a role decisively in shaping Israeli society and politics in any meaningful sense since the inception of Israel itself. And we should always read these movements, specifically these kind of fascist messianic, as spearheads within, a larger and broader structure that is, tilted towards expansion, racialization, domination, and forms of evacuation of the Palestinian body from the land of Palestine, whether symbolically or physically or otherwise. And we see it now manifest through the genocide. So it's that's one warning that I will say on that argument. But I think that even within this kind of liberal domain, we're seeing also these kind of like symptoms of how, people like Thomas Friedman, who have a hard time, mourning Zionism in of itself. He cannot do that or shed that Zionism that he holds quite dearly to himself, still trying to maneuver through basically distancing from this kind of version, or placing the onus or his hatred of Netanyahu as the problem per se. And I think, this is something also of, let's put it that way, being at least centered within liberal discourse, we should be aware of, but also see also as a symptom of this implosion, the incapacity to sustain your support of Israel, at the same time rejecting Israel, at the same time trying to redeem it. And what is worrying for me within these discourses is how a lot of, these opinion makers, institutional leaders, managers are trying to redeem Israel in some way or in some form or another. And that these redemptive analyses or acts or whatever, we should be aware of them because they're part of the ideological fight at this particular moment. And we should make sure that we fight back.
Appreciated. All right. So there's this other point you raised. Well, there's two things. So, let's do this one. So the war in Gaza and its dynamics, the shameless and shamelessness. Talk a little bit about what you're thinking about with this.
Well, I talked about this in a recent Electronic Intifada podcast with Omar Karmi, and I wrote an article in Mondoweiss a couple of weeks ago, and like an essay on the inauguration of a mall in Ramallah, and also like the idea of shamelessness or obscenity, which I think has become a sort of analytical tool for a lot of these kind of obscene masters and obscene forms of acting in the world, specifically people like Trump or right-wing leaders, or in many instances also, or in the context of Israel also, like the whole war machine and its festive form of killing and cruelty and punishment that it's enacting on Gaza. There is that level of analysis around shamelessness and how it becomes also a form of power in of itself, and I think that's important on one level. But I think that what I was trying to trace, because many ask what's happening in the West Bank, specifically among Palestinians in the West Bank, who are facing now kind of like facing the prospect of repetition of what happened in Gaza at some point in the future, being fearful of that prospect, living within the domain of a collaborationist regime like the Palestinian Authority, where a lot of people on some level reject this collaboration, yet at the same time, quite ironically, feel that this collaborationist regime is a source or a means through which they might survive. And in this sense, Israel was successful in containing any kind of outburst, at least from Jerusalem and the West Bank and from among Palestinian citizens of Israel in the past 18, 19 months. Of course, it used a lot of tactics, including imprisonment of a lot of people and torture and others to rein in what it means if you think about acting in many ways. And of course, going on the offensive when it comes to the killing of camps in the north of the West Bank, specifically the Jenin, Nur Shams, Tul Karim camps, and other places where Israel is destroying the camp and actually setting up almost permanent military bases within the camps itself and turning them into military zones. But beyond that, I think that there is an element of which we can take shamelessness and shameless as signs of political paralysis, because both the shameless within the West Bank and the shameful, if you want, are not acting. So there are people feeling the shame, the sense that in saying to ourselves we're unable to act, we should do something, but we're unable to stop the genocide, that we feel this sense of shame. But this is where it stops. And by feeling the shame, at least I'm living through the genocide as somebody who's receptive to it, as a spectator, and at the same time internalizing some sort of guilt and working through that guilt through a sense of shame that is present or co-present with how I carry myself in the world at this particular moment, which is understandable, of course, but it's still one that is not politically active or capable of mobilizing itself, at least for now. And at the same time, you have those who disavowed this political moment through the internalization of what I call the responsibility for what's going on in Gaza. And this was a concerted effort, psychic elements, ideological and political and informational warfare, but also one that was, we talked about it, Jared, before. One was that also, hammered down by operatives from the Fatah movement specifically and others who decided that this is a moment where, we should continue to hinge our discussion in Palestine around the decision by the resistance to breach the walls of Gaza, if it was a correct decision, etc. And I'm not here saying that this is a strategic, political, rational discussion. I don't think it is. I think that, on many ways, it's a way for people to disavow not only their non-participation, not only their inability to synchronize with this moment, but also a way through which one comes to blame oneself for a genocide that is happening against our people in Gaza, and of course could possibly and potentially start to enlarge to other places in many ways. So I think that that process, if you want, of putting the blame on Hamas, for instance, or Yahya Sinwar or whoever it is, helps you or helps those who are shameless to disavow the moment and to not feel a sense that they're compelled within this moment or within this historic moment to feel any sense of reaction or interaction or inhabiting this moment in any way, because they can place it on the onus of the decision by the resistance. And within that, there is some success on the part of Israel in tying what's happening in Gaza to resistance as such. And I think that's one of the problems that we have as Palestinians, is that I don't think resistance is the reason why genocide is happening. I think genocide has been planned, genocide and ethnic cleansing at the same time has been planned. It's been in the works before October 7th. It is what fascist movements have been displaying with quite strategic sense in their documents, in their teachings, in their pedagogy, in their violence on a daily basis, in the settler violence that is happening daily in the West Bank. So one of the problematics of that is that Israel, although it links some of its actions to resistance actions, it is in fact intended in the historical sense to actually eradicate the Palestinian people. So these people are reading history wrong. They're not realists as they think that they are. And at the same time, they're maneuvering the space through this sense of disavowal, knowing what's happening, yet at the same time still pretending like nothing is happening, and inaugurating a mall in Ramallah and opening it with festive cheers, I think is one symptom of that. It's not the only symptom. It's not only the problem with the mall. I think it goes deeper than that across Palestinian society. And of course, it manifests also within these discourses of political impotency that Palestinians have been saying to themselves, what can we do? We can't do anything, which also the Palestinian Authority quite repeats. And it becomes, there's an echo chamber that basically, repeats that. And at the same time, we reach this point where everybody just repeats the same motto, which is, there's nothing that we can do.
Yeah, there was something in there that you said that I wanted to pick up on if it comes back to me. So one of the things that I know what it was. I mean, so as far as the genocidal thing, I don't see how anyone, especially at this point, after all that we've seen, can think that the genocidal response that we have seen, I mean, people don't just have something happen to them, and then think, okay, we need to kill all of you. I mean, that's not a normal, it's not a normal reaction. Like, and as you said, I mean, this is a symptom. This has been something that you've seen, for so long, and it goes back, and it's fundamental to elements of Zionism. I mean, some of the theorists around settler colonialism would say that it's always present in settler colonial societies, this logic of elimination. But yeah, I mean, I think that should be self-evident at this point, whether you think it's something fundamental or not, that there's certainly a much longer history that these ideas of ethnic cleansing and genocide, they can't have just come out of nowhere. Otherwise it wouldn't be so widespread, so prevalent, so many manifestations. And I guess one of the things that you pointed at, I mean, we had it as the thumbnail for this episode, was this billboard, which went up a long time ago now. I mean, a while ago, but earlier on in the genocidal war, in the response, that was in Arabic and something along the lines of there's no future in Palestine, or no future in Palestine. And it has an image that may be harder to see from the thumbnail, but it's basically of Palestinians being kind of displaced. And yeah, I mean, you wanted to kind of, ruminate on that billboard with the title and so on. So say a little bit about that piece.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to it. I think, it was surprising to see settlers, raising billboards across the West Bank that said no future be Palestine in Palestine. But they didn't use fi, they used ba in Arabic, which is, quite weird. But anyways, beyond that, let's say linguistic problematic there, I think that most people read it, as propaganda, meant as, sort of, a propaganda that enunciates some sort of temporal foreclosure for us Palestinians. And of course, they're correct. It performs like some sort of violence and tries to evacuate any sense of futurity for Palestinians. And of course, places, as you said, the displaced alongside the statement as a sense of what comes for the Palestinians here in the West Bank, trying to encourage them perhaps to immigrate before they face the same fate or something along those lines, and using that interplay of image and words as a way to haunt us. But I think that there's one element of it which is eerie, beyond this kind of law of erasure, as you said, that is quite quite brutally honest here. It's very simple, honest. There's no future for you here, meaning that we'll probably kill you or displace you, or you'll have to leave on your own. But also, I think that it's on some level, we can sense from the actual erection of these billboards something that also is absent and lacking among these settlers, is that the fact that they're unable and incapable of actually truly evacuate the Palestinian, at least at this particular point of time. So you don't need a billboard if you're hell-bent on evacuating or killing and eradicating the Palestinian and erasing it. So there's something within the very presence and, let's say, articulation of this billboard that actually also points out to a lack among the settlers, as if the settlers themselves are kind of unsettled, and also as if the settlers themselves cannot actually construct a future that will imagines or that can still sustain that the Palestinians will be there at some level. Like that's one of the problematics that we spoke about when I told you about this whole total victory, decisiveness, etc. If they're capable or not of achieving that will remain part of the story as we move on. But I think that there is something in this attempt to foreclose that presupposes the trace of what it forecloses, meaning that actually there is some future in Palestine, and it's attempting to negate it and deny it. But this attempt to raise the billboard is as if it's like parasitic on the possibility kind of it seeks to extinguish. So what I'm trying to say is that in many ways the billboard is a sign of failure on the part of the Israelis. Not only a propaganda piece, it is, not only a psychological warfare, it is, but it's also a sign of failure of raising this statement and placing it front and center. Of course, if you look at the billboard, of course, it has these kind of, the bodies in motion, the blurred, indistinct walking or fleeing. This is what they want us to look like as we move. It also kind of harkens back to Nakba images of Palestinians being, forced to leave and walking their way to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and other places, Gaza, the West Bank, etc. The image is also kind of degraded. It's disoriented. It attempts to efface any form of testimony within itself. It has like the white text, which is quite bold and clear. And I think the image is not only a supplement here, but it's also kind of destabilizing the text itself, trying to assert it but also destabilize it, because saying the statement in of itself is not sufficient. You need to add the image with the text itself. So I think there's that element to it. And of course the colors are like purplish blue and indigo, or they slide into darkness. And I think it's a way of highlighting liminality, or like the twilight. I think the breaking of the day, perhaps something along along those lines, or the end of the day perhaps. And so there's all this kind of sensibility in it. It's raised as this like large signifier, like in the sky. There's many of these billboards. Some of them didn't have the images and the colors. They were just the text, like kind of minimalist. But this is one that had the colors, and it has this kind of visual thematic effect in it as well. And I think one of the really ironic, even comedic parts of it is that it's the most important, it's the most advanced recognition that Zionism has ever bestowed upon Palestinians, already embedded in this billboard. Why? Because it actually proclaims Palestine as such. Like it's actually acknowledging what it seeks to erase in many ways. And I think even in Oslo, when Israel recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization, it only signed the declaration that it recognizes the Palestinian Liberation Organization as a representative of the Palestinian people, but Palestine was never really part of the discourse, even the recognition at that particular point. So we can also look at it how, the settlers inadvertently recognized Palestine through this billboard, or at least placed it front and center by placing the text in itself there. And it's quite, ironic because of course it enunciates what it wants to erase, but at the same time, it's still equally, I think, dumb. So, at least on that level, the billboard also says that. But I think what for me is central here, and it goes back to the crisis of reproduction and the futurity. I think that this desire, this need to place that, as a billboard, not only as intended as, straight on psychological warfare, or, something that disrupts your daily routine of traveling within cities within the West Bank, but it also tells us something about the crisis within the settler who's unsettled. The crisis within the settler that is feeling that also his sense of futurity is on the line, that his ability to actually perceive and conceive of futurity is also quite problematic, and the need to actually perform this through a billboard and place it and state it, that points to this kind of lack and oracle that also kind of mirrors the crisis of futurity within Zionism itself.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think we've covered what we wanted to. Let me see. There may be something in the chat we can go to. I'll just say also to folks listening in, if there's other questions that you have, we can try our best to respond to them. Colin asked, could the lifting of Caesar's sanctions be partly to rearm and train up Syrian forces as a threat towards Iran or Lebanon? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, I honestly don't think at this particular point, Syria's new government is really capable of engaging. I mean, they might sell themselves as some sort of regional force that wants to become some sort of missionaries, on battle. But whether it's with Lebanon or with Iran, I don't think they have the competencies or capability to do that for multiple reasons. First of all, it's a matter of, logistics, armaments, etc., at least at this particular point. And maybe in the future that will happen, but not now. The second element of it is that, it's one thing to be a rebel group within a confined area within Syria, Idlib. It's another thing to lead and try to organize a highly diverse, ethnically and religiously society like Syria, and make it economically successful and sustain your legitimacy through time. Because this regime remains very fragile to chaos, to another round of a civil war, to openings within its various, let's say, sectarian elements. So it's a regime that needs to consolidate before doing anything like that. At this particular moment, what we can see is that they are moving towards, relations with Gulf regimes, which, and at the same time, trying their best to deny, logistical feeding of arms to Hezbollah, which is, one thing that they can do at this particular moment in terms of weakening and participating in the siege. And of course, arresting some of the remnants of the Palestinian resistance that exist in Syria. And, they have been arresting some members of Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, General Command, and others that have lived or continue to live in Syria, and accusing them of being part of the old regime and things along those lines. So at least that's my take. I mean, I'm not sure where the regime goes in terms of its future, but I think, again, it's one thing to lead a confined space like Idlib, and it's another thing to try to sustain a cohesive, coherent, economically viable Syria that extends from the coast to Damascus, Sham, to the north, and of course to elements and parts of the south as well. Specifically, when other countries are taking advantage, including Israel strategically, and interplaying on sectarian fears and trying its best to divide, conquer, and deny Syria from its military resources and some of its economic viability as well. So we'll see what this dynamic will lead. But the signs were already there among the rebels, specifically, the backing from Turkey, the U.S., from the Gulf regimes, from the outset of the Syrian civil war, that this is their geostrategic orientation, which is more aligned with, let's say, imperial interests more broadly. But at the same time, I think still the regime is weak, still feeble, and I'm not sure to what extent there will be a formidable force that is able to actually engage in long-term fights across its borders, including with Lebanon, and let's not forget also Iraq, which has a lot of political groups that are also aligned with Hezbollah and other forces that are aligned with Iran more broadly.
Yeah, thank you. So Renee asked, I'm wondering if the term liberal Zionist gives unnecessary grace. It almost gives the sense that there's a version of Zionism that is less problematic. I'll just say my thoughts on this quickly, and then if Abdaljawad has other things that he wants to add, welcome to, of course. I mean, I think so first I would say it depends on whether you think liberal actually is something positive or not. But I think that this has been a debate, I think, among Palestinians within the kind of solidarity movement of, how much of an alliance or relationship do we want to have with people who still believe in some version of a Zionist project. I'm sure it's also been a debate within Palestinian society as well, because I know there were eras where, communist parties or leftists, tried to work more with, labor elements or communist elements with, that were also Israeli, right? So there's been various versions historically of trying to figure out some force or group of people who are either Israeli or Zionist or both that you might be able to agree with on some kind of progressive agenda that might include more rights for Palestinians, less settlements and violence, and maybe some kind of two-state solution. So there's a lot of different kind of versions and histories of this, but I do think that there is a fundamental piece of it that is problematic, which is that it is still based upon some version of a Zionist ideology, which has these, as you said, like both kind of messianic elements, it has racist elements, it has elements of believing that there's some form of entitlement to another people's land that is bestowed by God or ethnicity or something along those lines. And so I think that there is something problematic about liberal Zionists for sure. But I think that I don't know that the term is unnecessary grace from my perspective, because I mean, I guess I get where your question is coming, because it's sort of like saying, is there some form of liberal fascist is sort of the way I read the question as you're asking it, Renee. And I think that in that sense, maybe you could say that there's something contradictory between the ideas of liberalism, just like people have pointed out that there's contradictory elements of people saying that Israel is, a Western democracy in the Middle East, when this so-called democracy doesn't actually have equal rights and representation of all the people that are under its control. So yeah, those are the thoughts I would have. I don't know if you have others.
Well, I mean, it depends if you see liberal as a good thing. So, I don't necessarily adhere to that. So, to me, liberal is not necessarily. I mean, you can see it now, like somebody like, I don't know, liberals in the U.S. where they follow the script of Trump, and at some point they echo the same policies, they start to engage with it. I mean, now in the UK, for instance, what's his name, the prime minister, Stammer, is coming out strong against
Keir Starmer, yeah,
coming out against immigration and copying the far right and trying to engage in a political rhetoric that resemble fascist governments or fascist elements within the UK, or let's say right-wing elements within the UK, nationalistic, anti-immigrant, etc. So for me, I mean, I don't think liberal in itself is necessarily a good word or something that is endearing, maybe on some level, but the difference, again, like an instance now among Israeli society, I mean, that is kind of like within this drive to the abyss, is not only that we're witnessing, again in Gaza, destructive, genocidal, obscene war, and it's not just another campaign kind of devastation. It's like it's a war that is being transfigured really into a structure that has no beginning and end, almost like something that pulses and repeats and insists without any form of ending. And within that logic, liberals come out only as kind of these managerial types, like pragmatic in tone, though hollow in substance. So they say something like, we've devastated Gaza, we've already exhausted them, we've already killed a lot of people, let's retrieve the prisoners and perform some sort of restraint and then resume the war whenever we want. That's the liberal line within Israel. That's what it means to be liberal in Israel today, at least the liberal center, or the center of Israeli politics, which is quite right-wing in its sense. So it's just saying, let's take a pause, we'll agree to stop the war, and then we'll return to war whenever we want, but let's retrieve the captives, because what they're concerned about and fixated on is the captives themselves and the prisoners, because of this kind of like historic binding between Israeli society as a settler society that has built settlements on frontiers, that whenever an Israeli is captive, that the Israeli state has an obligation to return these captives, which is something that a lot of resistance groups use to extract Palestinian prisoners and hostages that exist within Israeli prisons at this current moment. So that logic exists, and that's what it means to be liberal in Israel, and that's what it means when somebody like Thomas Friedman says Netanyahu is the problem, is that he's just saying that hey guys, we need your old pragmatism back. We need your old managerial style, the decent Israeli who speaks some sort of westernized democratic lingo and can at the same time not look like a complete buffoon, like somebody like Itamar Ben-Gvir when he speaks of Jewish power and separate roads for Arabs and Jews, and talks about and celebrates the idea of unleashing power and killing. Let's tame the discourse, let's decorate it a bit more, and let's sound more reasonable. Again, that's a difference between these two sides, in essence, if you want, or on a rhetorical basis. And of course there's like an element of a maximalist hallucination, if you want, within the context of Israeli fascists and messianic. There's a hallucination around this kind of maximalist position of trying your best through this insistence on the pulsion of war itself to perhaps achieve some sort of decisive end, which I think the liberals, more reasonably logical, at least on some level, would not see it in the same eyes. That's that's the difference between the two sides, because I think ultimately within religious messianic groups, the belief really of of the appearance of the Messiah, I'm not saying in a literal sense, but the appearance of this kind of messianic time where things are resolved, and you can reach some sort of nirvana or whatever you want, or some sort of new state of purification and cleansing, and ultimate manifestation of Jewish power kind of comes out within this kind of pulsion of war. So there's that hallucination that the liberals would see with suspicion. So that is a difference, at least on another level. But I don't mean it as an endearing term, and I don't think it's an endearing term. And when in Palestine, when somebody is called liberal, it's usually a curse. And anyways,
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked many times about our shared distaste for liberalism in many forms. There's a thing you said earlier on that I've just been thinking about a lot since you said it, which is this idea of Zionism as an ideology that had to be created, had to be formed as an idea and developed before it could achieve itself as a material, a material reality, before it could put facts on the ground that would eventually lead to a state that, and so on. And, it reminds me also of, people asking, I'm going to mess her name up, but Francesca Albanese, I think she's the UN special rapporteur or whatever, and they're ask her about Israel's right to exist, which again is this thing that never gets asserted for any other country in the world. Nobody ever talks about the right to exist of, the Netherlands or something like that. It's just not, it's not a term. It's not something that exists within international law or how people think about states or polities. But the she says it does exist, right, in response to this, like whether it has a right to or not, it is something that exists. And and I think that's an interesting part about this as you're talking about it. What I was getting stuck on is you talking about that it had to be developed of an idea before it could become some kind of reality. Whereas, as you said, like giving Palestine as the example, but this is really true for, all indigenous, groups that I can think of, which makes sense because it's part of what being indigenous is that, you're there, you're in a space, and you may not think of yourself through some kind of nation state or national project or whatever, because you live in, you have a material relationship to the land, you have a reality, you have your kinship, you have whatever. um and then it becomes, these groups are put into a defensive position later on where they have to assert some sort of national right or some sort of national claim, um, because it gets, disrupted by colonialism or settler colonialism in some kind of way. I mean, and that could take a lot of forms. It could take the form of, the carving up of Africa into, 54 states, or whatever, that are not states that are, um, agreed to based on some internal logic of the people within them saying, this is what makes sense. This is our land. These are our people, right? It's that, an imperialist decides we're going to carve this up this way for resource extraction, or we're dividing up this land between us, and this is how we're going to divide it up amongst ourselves, or we're dividing it up in ways that are inconvenient to the indigenous people or native people in purpose, because we don't want them to, band together against us. We want them to have their own sectarian or fratricidal, conflicts that we can foment as a divide and rule kind of strategy or whatever. But that it was just an interesting thing, and I don't know if you have more, thought that you've kind of put into that since you brought it up. But I hadn't really thought about it quite in those terms before, of this kind of the importance of the ideology preceding the kind of the material reality as opposed to the other way around.
Well, I mean, I haven't really quite, I think that there are manifestations of that you can easily point out, and we pointed out later, many times. Who cares? Why does Israel care if Trump recognizes the West Bank as annexed? Why is that important? Why is the U.S. bestowing recognition is important? There's something around Israeli settler attempt to nativize themselves through mimicry of Palestinians, even in terms of sometimes dress or forms of life, specifically when these settlers become shepherds, or turning from one instance to biblical imagery, but at the same time mimicking Palestinian Bedouins, for instance. That is also quite revealing of this kind of mimetic desire among or jealousy, if you want, of our relationship with the land, on some level. So on one level, you don't want to see us. On the other level, you take us as exemplars of some sort of relationship. But on the third level, you're always hearkening back to the empire to bestow recognition on the Golan. Yeah, there are political facts or political symbolic importance to these things, but as if you're always incomplete in relationship with the land, there's a lack. And it's something that we just don't have a crisis with, personally as Palestinians. That's one element of it. We do have it when we go into 1948, but not in the same way. It's of seeing how, Israel as this kind of material infrastructural level has been built, being faced with that fact. Of course, it was built by Palestinian laborers mostly. The homes, the buildings, the roads, the roundabouts, everything that was built was actually also built by Palestinian labor, tragically, of course, as well. But there's something around that feels estranging, and of course has this element of feeling both within your home, but at the same time as if your home was decorated by somebody else. And you can see it also with the type of environmental policies that was taken up by Zionism, with bringing European trees to make Palestine look more European. And we see these trees now burn quite easily, and fires erupting everywhere because of their non-indigenous status and their inability to actually sustain themselves within the weather becoming very dry, etc. So there is these elements of reconfiguring Palestine in terms of that feels estranging, but it's still not, it's a bit different. So like for us, I mean, I've always been suspicious towards nationalisms of all sorts, and nationalism to me also is problematic. Not this idea of love of homeland or things like that. Even though I don't have fully formed opinions around that, in a highly intellectual sense, because but my sense is that, for instance, in the context of Palestinian own history, that nationalism and Palestinian identity is used now as a form of national suicide, for instance. And that's why, nationalism in itself as this kind of idea, as this kind of collective imagination, as when it manifests materially through something like a dull managerial bureaucracy like the Palestinian Authority, becomes something that actually suffocates the idea itself and the imaginative component of it and its ability to radically mobilize, for instance, people in many ways. And in fact, it allows people like Abu Mazen to declare in the name of the nation the death of the nation at the same time. So there's a problematic there, but there is this level of how Palestinian identity comes to be constructed through this kind of relationship with a defensive posture. Now, it's not the only reason. I mean, there's a lot of disagreements within the literature, even among Palestinians. Some trace Palestinian nationalism to before, Zionism and its, its arrival in Palestine. through Zionist, immigration to Palestine in the late 19th century. They trace it to the disruptions in the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and some of its interior. They just, trace it to other parts in this kind of long 19th century where a lot of developments were happening also within Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. But, to me at least, the consolidation, intensification of this form of identity has a relationship. There's this kind of, its ontology is one of that is very defensive, and therefore, you can build a constructive relationship with this kind of defensive posture. Although, like any form of defense, like your immunity system, sometimes that immunity, if it becomes excessive, like in the case of the PLO, it turns against itself and becomes some sort of immune disease or some sort of immune disorder. But yeah, that's my take. And I think when it comes to this kind of diasporic Jewish tradition that tried to coalesce around the idea of a return, between quotes, of coming back, of even going up the hill, Ayala, or I think which means like now the new immigrants, Oleh Khadashim, for instance, like the idea of the new immigrant who rises to Jerusalem, goes back to Jerusalem, comes from this kind of religious discourse, the gathering of the Jews that are diasporic. There's an element on which some sort of religious, biblical, Talmudic, uses of that idea, fused with colonialism and, of course, anti-Semitism and its mutations, and of course with imperial designs around the region that come and fuse together. And this is not to say that but it's only to say that Zionism was fabricated in many ways. Fabricated here, it doesn't mean it's not real or like an illusion or just a lie. But fabricated as an ideology before it became some sort of movement that people worked for and a cause that people yearned for, and that was consolidated through this relationship again with the Jew being the internal enemy within European history, and that was tragically manifested also in the Holocaust as one example among many. So I think that in this sense, in this element, an idea that is fabricated before it became or returned to the land, and then and here I say returned, not just emulating or echoing the discourse that Zionists themselves say, because I'm not sure if it's a return. Like that's another aspect of it. It's this declaring of being indigenous to the land when probably and most likely the Palestinians, the modern day Palestinians, are the inheritors genetically and of or whatever it is. I don't know if it's genetically, but I don't think that there's this kind of discontinuation like Zionism presents, where Jews move out, Christians come in, Christians move out, Muslims come in. I mean, I think the people of the land mixed with a lot of different people, and the Palestinians or whoever lives in this land, we're also part and parcel of that lineage that also extends back to, if you want, Jewish Palestine and Christian Palestine, and the influence of also Arabs and Muslims within the domain of Palestine itself. And just to say that there's a continuous history that goes back, and you can see it in terms of the amount of local identity and traditions that are also strong in Palestine. Something like Italy, which is, when you go to Bologna and you go to Napoli, like Palestine has that similar tendency in accents and people's behavior and customs and norms and different foods and there's a rich tapestry of differences. They might be narcissistic, but they play an important role. And that's why even in Arabic, we don't say al-balad, which is, a singular. Balad means the country. We say liblad, which means like this kind of multiplicity of different towns and cities. So it's like a plural form of referring to Palestine as a multiplicity, So in many ways, I think that, I mean, that is the relationship to our own sense of identity. It comes out of this kind of necessity, defense. Of course, it's also a modern day invention, nationalisms more broadly. But again, the relationship with the land is more organic, that it doesn't need these kind of performative recognitions at the same time from the outside or desire it. And even when the Palestinian Authority speaks of recognition, and internationalization, it doesn't really resonate. It's not something that really people, in Palestine think of as important to kind of like assert their own ownership over the land. And I don't think we also think of ownership necessarily of land in the highly like consumerist, privatized sense. The relationship to the land, although it's changing, I think that's becoming part of like, the consumerist ideology that is slowly penetrating the Palestinian society. And of course, people are being turned towards looking at land as ownership and as a commodity to be sold and acquired. But the relationship is a bit more different. It's a source of life. It has this kind of material relationship, and where the Palestinian himself is possessed by the land rather than seeking to possess it. So that this is like the relationship. I think with Zionism, it's like this: we need to possess it, we need to change it, we need to decorate it differently, we need to reframe it, we need to change its aesthetics, we need to Jewadize it, Israelize it. So in many instances, that desire already shows again a lack. I already spoke that about how Israelis are obsessed of raising flags everywhere and placing their flag everywhere as a sign of possession. Again, the billboard is another sign of that. This idea of lack, including by declaring that we don't have a future, that also secretly that they're thinking that they don't have a future. So like all of this comes together in many ways. I know I've talked a lot and went into many off ramps, but yeah.
No, that was good. I appreciate it. I'm going to save this question for a future discussion, because I think this would be a good thing to kind of maybe delve into in a little bit more detail, which would just be kind of to talk about the state, the state of Israel, and John Locke and liberal thought, and some of the fundamental issues and contradictions also within John Locke's vision and within liberalism and in, again, when I say liberalism here, because somebody asked a question about this before, like I'm especially when you're thinking about John Locke too, not talking about liberalism just in terms of like the Democrats are liberals and the Republicans are conservative. It's really about a specific political structure and order, and that also has judicial elements and so on. But I really think there's a more interesting conversation to have there, because on some level, we might argue that Israel does comport itself with that vision, and that should tell us everything that we need to know about what liberalism actually is, and the kinds of decisions and sacrifices and problems that are intrinsic to a kind of liberal order. But anyways, I mean, I don't know if you have any short thoughts on that, but I think.
Well, I remember Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was interviewing Benjamin Netanyahu, and they raised up Locke as kind of an ideologue for the idea of the relationship between laboring with the land and at the same time owning the land, as a premise through which settler colonialism can actually legitimate itself as well, because ownership is tied to labor within the land. And of course, within that imagery, it wasn't surprising to see some of the socialists. Now, we're changing from liberalism to socialism. Socialist kibbutzim, who were still, Zionist, who looked at the Palestinians as part of the natural scene. So we're like animals, not humans, that were easily dispossessed. It's a land without a people. The only people are the people that can actually labor within the land and turn the desert into this garden. And within that discourse, yeah, I mean, the idea of laboring with the land and actually, the idea of the kibbutz as a socialist experiment was very foundational to the propaganda through which a lot of new recruits to Zionism were actually enticed, and to which also Zionism was able to penetrate the imaginary of the Western left for a long period of time, and still does in many ways. So I think that part of the relationship to the land through labor played a role. Of course, as many historians of Israel will point out, that was more fiction than reality. And as I also point out just earlier, that even Israel itself, as an infrastructure of houses and networks of electricity and roads and all of these material, even airports, etc., most of the labor that actually went into building this infrastructure comes from Palestinian labor itself. So even the laboring part is within the logic of Lockean, let's say, understanding of property as the time and effort you place with the land, which gives you the right to possess it, is something that has to do with the Palestinians themselves. But of course, I mean, many people and writers have already pointed out that Locke's theory of government and his treatise on government was already, a colonial or influenced by, the United States specifically, and by the, colonialists in the United States, the settler colonialists, and their relationship with the land, which was also similarly, in many ways, where indigenous and slave labor was actually more important and central than, the white labor. And even that, despite that, still the whole theory of government was constructed basically on this kind of Lockean paradigm. I don't want to go much more into it, but I think that that idea played a role, of course, and the other idea that played a role, which is the idea of democracy, which you, Jared, pointed out. I don't want to go into it. I think that people who say Israel is a democracy, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's I don't know, what to say to them. I mean,
yeah,
I think that stupidity is playing a big role among a lot of smart people. I mean, that's a problem with it. And I think I heard Ilan Pape, which I agree with quite completely, is that a lot of smart people, when it comes to Israel, become stupid. I mean, they don't want to recognize real facts, hard facts, or they're racist and they just don't consider Palestinians human and therefore not worthy of being part of democracy or having a voice in it. But Israel, at least in relation to us, is a terror regime. It always has been. It's nothing new. It can arrest whoever it wants at will, place them under detention for long periods of time without any kind of. We don't have the right to vote. We don't have the right to do anything, of significance in terms of political participation, etc. The military laws that exist on paper are military laws that actually prevent assembly, political participation, prevent us from, expressing opinion. They're strict. They're rules that the military government and the governor can change at any point. This is the type of legal infrastructure that we live under. It's been going on for 70 years or more. Even our military governance system was actually transplanted from a military governance system that existed among what is now called the Palestinian citizens of Israel, that are paraded in Israeli propaganda as a sign of Israeli democracy. Because here, look, we have some Arabs that we treat, as second-class citizens, but they still can live and breathe and work. So beyond these elements, I mean, yeah, there is that kind of democratic sensibility where people are. On some level, Israel's settler colonialism is justified through this kind of hollowed out surface level idea that it's democratic.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I think it would be an interesting episode to kind of go deep dive into a lot of the contours of this to kind of, talk about both what it reveals about Locke and Lockean liberalism, as well as what we could say about you know, the falsehoods, and all those kind of things. It would be an interesting discussion. I did want to say, just quick plug, because that conversation around Peterson talking to Netanyahu and talking about Locke and laboring on the land and this mythology. I did have a discussion last week on the Red Nation podcast with Nick Estes, and we did talk about Jay Sakai's Settlers, which is a controversial book among some folks, but he does a really good job, I feel like, of attacking that mythology within the United States context. This exactly what you're talking about, of this notion that on the one hand you have this strong mythology, ideology, political thought that paints this picture of, European families working in farms, laboring on the land, being self-sustaining, being pioneers, this kind of discussion and idea, private property being, imposed in areas where it didn't exist before. And that, the reality of this was land theft again of indigenous people, and then, as you say, slavery, forced labor programs and things like this, usually predominantly African at a certain point, although there were efforts to also do this with indigenous folks, to have forced labor or slavery with indigenous folks. And then then there's becomes other dynamics later on as you bring in a lot of European immigrants. Again, another thing that we could talk about with the context of Israel, the different waves of immigration that have come in for certain purposes. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting parallels on that level between the settler colonial nature of the United States and its history, as well as Israel, of course. All right, I don't want to go further because we've covered a lot today. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that we will have another discussion soon. Hopefully we'll have some better news to talk about soon. I hope. Certainly my heart and my mind are with all the people in Gaza who are enduring the genocide, and just the full spectrum blockade of aid that's going on, and even the denialism that's going on in the Western media around famine and things like this. I mean, it's pretty dark, and I know that I'm hopeful that soon at least we'll see some changes in those dynamics that can get people some immediate relief. Obviously my aspirations are bigger than that, but that would be something that's needed at this time. So anyway, I thank you again, Abdaljawad, for your time and for your analysis, and it's always great to be in conversation with you.
Thank you, Jared.